Today's topic, we'll be discussing violence in sports. So violence, it's when you use excessive force that causes or could have potential to cause harm or destruction. Usually it's thought of as illegal, unsanctioned actions, but there are times, we know this, violence is encouraged or approved by groups or societies. An example, deviancy is something that is unsanctioned, not allowed, it's not okay. Sometimes protecting people and property is approved and necessary when it comes to violence. In sports, we know this, it can be used to entertain, but when it's aimed toward an official, a referee, it's considered illegal and becomes punished. Within football, violence is used to show a status. Those hard, violent attacks, are looked at as a way to help the team. The ability to be violent and also to endure violence on a football field gives a player an identity. Aggression, it's important to understand. It's grounded in intent to dominate, control, or do harm to another person. So when it's involved in violence, violence may occur inadvertently or carelessly without that intent. So aggression can occur within a sport without intent. So that gives us a way to determine whether the aggression is it assertive, competitive, or achievement-oriented violence. Intimidation are just words, actions, or gestures that are threatening violence or aggression. It's used to get that mental edge, in sports to dominate or control another person. So what does violence look like throughout history? It's not new to sports, as we've discussed. We've watched video on the different violence in the medieval times, the Roman gladiators. Deaths occurred regularly with the Mayans and the Aztecs when they did their ritual games. Medieval and early modern Europe, their training was more for war and a consequence of war. Lots of consequences, death, permanent injury. But then sports became more organized. Rules started to take that violence out, prohibit certain, which of course decreased bloodshed, and now athletes have to demonstrate more self-control. The rates have not decreased, but the violence has changed to a more controlled version with the commercialization, professionalization, and sports going globally. It's the dramatic violence is there, and it's still part, but it's more controlled. You see in patriarchal societies, the violence and aggression, it was used for power purposes to show that men were more powerful than women. And you have to, when it comes to sports, you have to analyze it through historical, social, cultural context, just like many things. Once you can understand situations, in this case violence, through those different lenses, you gain a better understanding of what violence, in this case, meant or means to sports. So, on the field violence, the brutal body contact, it's accepted. It's a certain part of sports. For example, tackling in football you see here, checking in hockey, punching in boxing. Those are all within the realm of those sports. Now, borderline violence violates the rules, but it's like, hey, that's part of playing the game. You see here brushback in baseball, elbows, kneeing in soccer, fights in hockey. Things that you'll probably get a penalty for, you'll serve some time for within that event, but it's accepted as part of the sporting event. Quasi-criminal violence, these violate the formal rules of the game, public laws. So you have your cheap shots, late hits, the sucker punches, things like that. Those are quasi-criminal. Criminal violence, clearly outside the law, you're assaulting people after or during games. And during our discussion, you might notice there's some clips in this presentation. We'll view these and discuss further. Over-conforming to the norms. So, as we've discussed, in some sports, violence is normal. When a player over-conforms to this, it fosters a greater level of violence. So what is a good football player? Ndamukong Suh, if you've heard him speak off the football field, he's a very intelligent person. He seems very mild-mannered. But he, in past years, has received quite a few fines for being violent on the field. Athletes like this can become legendary. And maybe athletes who overconform, there's an insecurity. So they want to affirm that they're tough, they're part of this team, or they're the enforcers for whatever team to fit into with their teammates. Commercialization of violence. It draws people's attention, brings in money. They're not violent for the money. The athletes who are in these sports, they've been that way since the start. So even if you remove this pay, the research says, violence is still going to be a part of those sports. So commercialization, although it's there, it's prevalent, we're seeing more of it. It's not the cause of violence. Violent talk. Again, it's to get that mental edge, that hype the game. When you're commercializing it, the announcers are hyping it up, just like an athlete would use that violent talk to get into the player's head. Announcers are using it to get more viewers, hype up the game. So when is it too much? You see some of these pictures here. UFC and MMA can become extremely, extremely violent. Masculinity and violence. It's a way to show that you're masculine if you are violent. It's the cornerstone of masculinity when people view it this way. You're hurt. You need to play through the pain. You need to be a man. Those are ways that we reinforce masculinity in the overconformity in sports. Dominant ideology links that manhood with your ability to do violence. You're a man because you're tough, you're strong, you did these certain things, so you're more manly. Things that we'll discuss about further in class. Violence in men's sports, it's that commitment. Wow, look at them, they're hurt. You can see the physical pain, but they're playing through it. They're committed. But if a female's violent, they're not always looked at in the same light. It does not promote femininity. It's more masculinity, so it can cause some issues there. Okay, violence in non-contact sports. Slamming ball, bat, or helmet, yelling at officials, using the violent language. These are how violence can occur in non-contact sports. And it can be strategic. You see Lou Piniella there in the face of the umpire. He's using strategy here, possibly. Or maybe he is just upset. Okay, violence in contact sports. Research shows that athletes welcome this, even if they have to break the rules. Here's a quote: "Fighting is a tool. Fighting can be used to inspire your team, send a message, change momentum." That was said by Barry Melrose, a hockey broadcaster commentator. And violence in contact sports can be used as strategic. There's a clip there we'll show next class. Okay, in women's contact sports, this is becoming more accepted. There's not a lot of research information because it's fairly new with women participating in these commercialized fights, these UFC fights. It's become more competitive, though. You see that. Women, just like men, they're willing to take these risks and sacrifice and play through injury just like men. So they're breaking down these racial ideologies by doing these contact sports. Pain and injury. Okay, people like the physical nature of sports, but the injuries can make you uncomfortable. You know, having ankle issues in my past, anytime someone rolls an ankle, breaks an ankle, something like that, I mean, I cringe. It makes me uncomfortable. 80% of male and female college athletes sustain at least one serious injury, and 70% are disabled for 2 or more weeks. So there's a price to be paid here. How do we control on-field violence? About 90% of the serious injuries in sports occur within the rules. It's kind of a staggering statistic there. So how can we control it? Well, change these gender ideologies. You're hurt, you're a football player, you know what, for the benefit of you, long term, sit out. No, don't be a man, don't try to play through it. So change these ideologies. Keeping record of injuries, you know, we're seeing this more and more with concussions and the prevalence of that. There are some things that are being put in place to make us more aware and monitor these situations. Calculate cost of injuries, you know, suspensions without pay, you can't practice, etc. You see the helmet to helmet in football, leaving your feet in hockey. There are prices to pay if you do these things within the field of play. Off the field, violent sports do not cause people to be violent outside of their sport. So you have this issue of control versus carryover. There was a study done for 3 years at a boxing gym in Chicago. The researcher, I'm not even going to attempt to say the name up there, observed, interviewed, and documented the experiences and lives of over 50 pro boxers. The findings were, hey, boxers, they value what they do, dedicate themselves to it. They respect other boxers for doing the same things they're doing. And they disapprove of fighting outside of the ring. So they have that control. Their aggressive nature, their fighting does not carry over into society. So they may learn to control it if that sport emphasizes a nonviolent self-control, respect for the self and others. But that's not, unfortunately, the way most sports are organized. You see their emphasis there: hostility, physical domination, using your body as a weapon. But the overall point here is sport participation does not automatically teach people to control violence, nor does the violence used in certain sports carry over to other relationships and settings. Assaults and sexual assaults by male athletes, another prevalent, issue that we've seen the last few years in sports. Seattle Times in 2003 found 159 coaches in the state of Washington fired or reprimanded in this 10-year span for sexual offenses, but it was kept secret if they left their job. That's ridiculous. If you've done something like that and you leave your job, well, you're free to go do that somewhere else, even though you've, done this sexual offense. It's ridiculous. The crimes of assault and sexual assault, it goes beyond sport. Okay, there's still a need to address the uniqueness of this and how it associates with sports culture. But we need to look at the victims here. We have to know those experiences. Okay, sporting events, violent conflicts. It's rare at non-contact sporting events, but for contact sports, it's not common, but it does occur, so there should be some research on this. Crowd violence was common. We've talked about this. We've seen examples of this in the films we've watched. You see the different issues here. So many people see violence among spectators as a problem today. It's no worse than it was in the past. Celebratory violence, this is inside stadiums, storming the court, things like that, fights among fans. 3 factors that can cause this: action of the sporting event. It's intense. The diehard fans. So it could lead to these confrontations. Crowd dynamics, the crowd size, intense rivalries. These can lead to issues within spectators. Historical, social, economic, political context, it could definitely cause for some violence to go down at an event. So how do we control it? We have to visible, meaningful connections between teams, communities in which those places occur. Here's a summary, and we'll see you next class.